Okay, well, thanks to those for joining at the end of the afternoon for this session, AI and accessibility. This is a bit of a patchwork session, I suppose, in a way, because that's quite a massive topic. One of the things that I would like to talk about really are just some of the issues around this that don't really get very much discussion, but I think are really important when we're considering how we're using AI and who we're asking to use which AI tools and the kind of wider implications of that. So some of this is a bit uncomfortable, but I think it's stuff that we need to think about and talk about if we're approaching using AI more widely in education. Now, this is education in the age of generative AI. I did just make the point that we are talking about generative AI in this session. More traditional AI, if there is such a thing, has been a staple of accessibility tools for a really long time. But one of the reasons I think this distinction is really important to make, not just in what I'm talking about today, is that it has panicked students because there's been a huge backlash in some areas against AI. And we've had students who use speech recognition tools and dictation tools and things like that panic because this uses AI, am I not allowed to use it anymore? And it's not a problem, it's not an LLM, it's not using generative AI. So again, that distinction is quite important to make when we're talking about it, but also when we're talking about it with students, just about actually what is and isn't okay. But today, pretty much on the generative AI. And that in itself is a bit of a problem because there's an awful lot of accessibility tools that we have known and maybe not loved, but certainly used over the years. And a lot of them now, it's very trendy, they're all now with AI. And it's not always clear what that AI feature does, what the improvement is. It's kind of new improved recipe and you're not quite sure what's going on with it. It also really complicates it a lot in terms of the acceptable use if it's a student tool. Grammarly's introduced some new AI features, which I think most people would not consider acceptable use, where it will basically look for the profile of your tutor, if you give it the information, and it will predict the grade of your essay based on what it knows about the tutor, based on what you've written. I don't know how well that's going to go down as a tool, but that was a recent announcement. It also complicates a lot of things around GDPR and security. So there are tools that we've been using for years that security are quite happy with us using, and suddenly they've got an AI component. And because often these things are effectively black box, they are proprietary AI. They don't want to tell everybody how they're doing it. We don't know what it's doing, which is something I'll come back to later. That's often a problem in itself. But we don't necessarily know about data storage, security of data, adherence to certain things, where in the world it's being stored, all this kind of thing, which adds a lot of complication. So there are some tools now that I'm a little bit worried that we might not be able to use as safely as we have previously because they're now adding in these elements. I'm not always sure what the benefit of that is as well. But one of the things I wanted to talk about, because I think one of the most common uses of it currently in a lot of mainstream teaching, is image description, alt text. And if you're not adding alt text to your images and slides and links, please do. Alt text is the thing that's going to be read out by a screen reader if somebody using one of those gets there. It's also quite useful if you hover over things. I find it useful for celebrities I don't know, if I see a social media post about them. But also if the page doesn't load, you quite often see that little text there. And it's not a science, it is an art, image description. It's very difficult to say specifically what you should do. It's very, very contextual. And the context is a key point around that. But I've met people who want as little image description as possible because they can't see it, they don't want to just know what's there, move on. And I've met other people who are terribly worried about them missing out and they want a very full image description. And that's two blind people using screen readers with a completely different approach. Disability is never a monolith. So there isn't a kind of definite right way to do this. But I think there are questions about what we're doing with generative AI around this. Generate text is quite a common feature now in Google Slides and in PowerPoint, and it's one of the most common things people are using AI for. Now, like I said, the context is really important because it can usually recognise what the picture is, usually, and will tell you something basically descriptive about it. But the point of the picture really is why you chose it. Is it a typical example, a good example, a local example? Is it just an illustrative thing that you thought was quite fun? What about it made it relevant? And the computer's not going to know that. So if you're really unused to writing image description, it can be a good starting point. If you look at something, you're like, I have no idea where I would start with that. What's the computer say? Isn't a bad starting point, but you should always review it at the very least to check it hasn't done something weird. And the same really with auto-generated subtitles and captions, because sometimes different voices, it's improved a heck of a lot, but it's doing all sorts of things. Like goodness knows what captions are doing right now with my accent. It has improved an awful lot through COVID, but it will vary an awful lot. So they always do need checking. You can't just rely on the AI on its own. And that tends to be true of most generative AI tools for most things. It does need checking. But this is a particularly good example. That was my outfit. This is a lovely picture from campus. We've got some sculpture there and 2 geese. Copilot decided these were geese sprinklers because the fountains are behind the geese. And it's sort of like geese sprinklers are obviously a thing. I don't know, it was a really odd thing. So again, it can get it horribly wrong, even on something that's a fairly straightforward picture that isn't complex. And if you then think about the kind of range of topics we have and the depth that people are going into, you know, it's going to get worse with more complex images. But I think there's a really big question here about, is this the only bit of AI you're using? Because I know for a lot of staff it is. And if the only bit of generative AI you use is to create accessible format, is only going to be read by disabled people, people who need the captions, people who need that image description. What does that say? Would you use it elsewhere in your work? Is this the only place you're comfortable using it? In which case you're comfortable for disabled people to use that, but maybe not other people. And what does that say about disabled student experience? I think there is a question here about if that's the only place you're willing to use it, what does that say about your engagement with accessibility? What does that say to the students you're teaching? Because often students will complain to us, and part of the digital accessibility unit, we get complaints about really weird captioning and kind of terrible alt text. Students do notice, they are aware. So if you're using it very badly, they will know. And there's kind of do as if you would be done by thing about this. And I don't think enough AI talks have weird pictures from the water babies in them, and more should refer to Charles Kingsley. But there is the whole do as you would be done by and be done by as you did, which is the weird picture there. But essentially, do you want to read AI generated content? Would you feel comfortable with that? Would you want your learning materials to be that? And if you're not sure about that, how are you using it with students? And specifically, are you using it for materials for disabled students and only disabled students? Because again, I think there are really big questions here about what we're asking people to do. And if we're pushing a particular demographic to use these tools more than others, where's the equity in that? I think these, I'd say, difficult questions, but I think they are ones that need answering about how we approach this. And part of this is because a lot of these tools are really unreliable. And one of the things is the perpetuation of bias. So essentially, if it's a big open AI tool, LLMs, they're learning off the whole internet, there's a lot of bad stuff on the internet. There is an awful lot of bias. Part of this is the presence of fields that have been dominated by certain figures or certain things over the years. So if you ask AI to generate images of doctors, it tends to be white men, because Western literature has tended to dominate that field. So there are certain biases that are going to be kind of pushed there. But this is coming in multiple forms, in that the data you're putting in is potentially working with that, and you're kind of generating more. So it can also generate content and inform the decision making. So it's something that people have looked at a lot in terms of race and gender, less so in terms of disability, but it does seem to perpetuate the same things. So this is a very good example, I think. I've got the link to the paper there from 2024, and she was demonstrating the racial differences. If you put the word black into any of the image generations, you get a very different kind of neighbourhood. And this is one set of images, but in all of them, you end up with much cleaner, brighter neighbourhoods if it's a white child. And also white is the default. You have to prompt racial difference in these. But if you put in the word black, you end up in much more broken down, poorer looking neighbourhoods very, very quickly. And it's an interesting article. There's a lot of images around this, and it's a really notable difference. But again, that idea of the normative being generally white, cis, male, able-bodied, and you're having to push it outside that every single time. And one where they have done this around disability earlier this year, this is kind of text to image generation. Again, very interesting about how disability is actually portrayed. Disability is almost always about the physical difference in these. So they tend to like somebody in a wheelchair or with an artificial limb. It wants it very visible that somebody is disabled. And I mean, there's some interesting things going on with the hands, because obviously that's a bit of a thing with AI images. But this one, they wanted a doctor with a disability and a patient without a disability. And it really, really struck me with that. It's one of them. One of them, the doctor has a visible disability and the patient doesn't. That doctor may have invisible disabilities, we don't know. The AI wasn't really good at those. But again, it's just really struggling with that because what it's learned from is that's not what disabled people look like. Now, this is a wider problem. There are projects that look at kind of stock imagery of disabled people, and there are particular photo banks that specialise in people of colour and disabled people and the intersections between those to try and correct some of the availability of photos. So it's not specific. You can see why it's coming out with this. But if you're getting it to generate images, and even if it's just like a header for your VLE site or something like that, what kind of biases and things is it potentially taking with it? There's all sorts of things that kind of underline this. What's interesting about this, and again, linked to the study there, all the things around race and gender they had to put in specifically, it does default to white male. And their conclusion from doing this test with all sorts of disability things was that currently it's normative versions of society. And it's very much a medical model. So again, about very physical disability, very visible idea of difference and disability. And it's going to perpetuate harmful stereotypes. And this was a very big study, and they've done a lot of different things there. And that's really just about images. That's something quite light in a way. That's not making decisions that are going to necessarily affect somebody's ability to apply for things or anything like that. And with that inability of the AI, we've got the question, is it fair to rely on it? I just say a lot of things will need checking. This was a study earlier this year. And again, this is interesting because it's closed set data as well. It was just on the BBC News. So again, this isn't on the internet. This isn't kind of spoof stories and it's mistaken something from The Onion as real or things like that. This is just on a fairly standard news website. 51% significant issues of some form. 13% are misattributing quotes. Now, if you think about using academic sources, actually about half the stuff is going to have a major problem in it. And 13% of the stuff is going to have quotes made up. That's really quite a lot. And again, this is going to affect anyone using these tools who doesn't check them. It's going to affect anyone using the tool, really. But again, students keep being pushed towards it. This will help you. You're disabled. This will help you. They are really heavily marketed towards disabled students. And some staff have kind of lent into that as well. And I think the more we're asking people to rely on it, there are questions about that. Because these need reviewing. And it does make some people more vulnerable. So people who are not working in their first language may be more vulnerable to spotting the inaccuracies. And again, there is the whole thing of machine bias, automation bias. And if you're not very confident, if you've been told this will help you, and it looks a bit wrong, do you question that or do you go with that? Because often students are going to go with, we have this automation bias. Well, the program will know better than I do. And we've seen people adopt quite a lot of mistakes because of that. And also the tools, I mentioned they're kind of a bit black box. There's some interesting stuff coming out quite recently. This is a librarian called Aaron Tay, who's very interested in open data and AI. And one of the things about this is we don't really know what it's doing. Google Scholar's always been a little bit fuzzy on the edges about what it actually searches. But with other tools, we can control that. Things like illicit and consensus, we don't really know. But what they're mainly using are these things that are called open aggregators, so kind of lists of abstracts, and that's where it's pulling that information from. People are not getting happy about the way it's using those, so publishers are pulling them. So Elsevier, Nature have pulled them from OpenAlex, which is one of the really, really big open aggregators. So those are papers that won't get found. They're behind paywalls, but we'll probably have access to some of those. So if somebody went through Web of Science or your search and we're using the university tools, they would find them. If they're using an online AI tool, they're not going to. That's been his testing. That's one person testing quite recently. We don't know how far this is going, and this trend is quite new. But given the very defensive response of publishers to AI, it could continue. So again, if we're pushing people to rely on AI tools specifically, they're not reaching all the information. They're being limited. But they're also potentially having information suppressed. So again, there's been a bit of work on this. Essentially, a whole load of these are suppressing topics. Now, it often feels like censorship tends to be more in America at the moment in terms of the Western world. China obviously has quite heavy censorship. It tends to be something we don't tend to think about very much. But these are global tools and they're owned by people all over the world. So this was an American study, but it was with a tool that owns the software behind our library catalogue. So it's all bleeding into each other. It's a global network of information. Key phrases came back with no results. So Aaron Tay again had a look at this in July and was looking specifically at them. Clarivate owned tools, so that includes ours. Ex Libris is the company that owns Alma, which is the thing behind your search. Clarivate is badly affected, but Web of Science also affected. So again, this is coming into tools that we're using and we may not think about being censored. And in practice, phrases that came up with no result included, this is not the full list, but included those, so garter wall, all sorts, and this is the error message you would get back. Now, librarians found by doing structured searches, because they knew that there was material about these in the catalogues, they knew it's there, they were able to actually get hold of stuff if you prodded it, if you did different searches. But those aren't unreasonable search terms to use as a scoping search, just pop it in and see what's there. That's not an unreasonable thing to do, and that's what you get. Different or more general topic is the first suggestion. Now, again, affects everybody, but if we're pushing certain groups towards it, we're potentially encouraging them to use very heavy censorship, heavily censored sources, which again, I think there are questions around. So is it making a vulnerable population more vulnerable? If we are pushing people to use AI tools, we're pushing towards potentially unreliable and biased information. We're potentially pushing them into a world where there are fewer information sources readily available to them. There's a lot of GDPR and security vulnerabilities. There are certain things we don't have. So Grammarly, we don't have on any managed device at the university because it just doesn't meet the GDPR and security guidelines. There are all sorts of things where it's quite problematic. And a lot of these tools, and I mentioned the publishers being very defensive, effectively break copyright rules. So you're pushing somebody to potentially break the law or put their details at risk to use something that makes something more accessible to them. Now, in part, I would argue that this is because publishers have terribly inaccessible websites, and frankly, people can't access things in the way that they want. I think if publisher websites were much more accessible and flexible, we wouldn't quite have the explosion of this kind of tool that we do, because they're frankly not easy to use. If you're dyslexic and you need to change the font, or you need to download it and use it with screen reader, it's a nightmare trying to do that with them. So I understand why these tools proliferate, I really do. But I think there are a huge amount of risks about the reliability of what it's going to do for you, about what it's going to store about you. We don't know. We don't know what information is there. And it's often commercial and it's multinational and we don't know who owns these. There's a huge explosion of these companies. These are not known brands. We have no idea what's going on. And I think the current kind of, this will help, this is fine. Where I think that energy may be better pushed towards publisher platforms. Why isn't your stuff more accessible? Rather than going, this will fix the inaccessible platform, which seems to be the way we're leaning at the moment. And with that is the data collection, because with, oh, hello, quite a crash from upstairs, not sure what's going on there. People profile internet users, and that's why if one of your friends gets married, suddenly you'll see loads of adverts about weddings if we're not all using incognito windows all the time. So it's not a new thing, but again, the black box nature of AI tools really exacerbates this because we don't know what they're doing. We don't really know what's going on about that. One of the things about this is significant in that there are various things people have talked about predicting clinical depression. The study I linked to here is about detecting Parkinson's disease, and that's around typing and navigation of a screen that they think they can detect early onset Parkinson's. Now, that was quite an interesting study, and it's designed to work in conjunction with diagnosis. It wasn't about outing people with Parkinson's and stopping them getting insurance or something, but realistically, that's often how this stuff is used. And if we're asking students from the age of 18 to be using this, and we don't know where their data is going, that's their digital footprint. This is something that actually is worrying me a bit, because as my joints deteriorate, oh gosh, is someone tracking as my typing gets worse during a flare-up? Is that something that's visible? The fact that people are even using assistive tools in a way kind of outs them, potentially with certain assistive tools. Lillian and I probably have terrible profiles because we use all sorts of them to test things, but other people, if they're using it consistently, well, yes, that person, if they're using a screen reader all the time, probably needs a screen reader. We can infer some things around that. So again, it's recording data about us, but we don't know what data. And it's data that, again, not new. It can be used against people in all contexts. But in the context of disability, particularly in countries like the US, where insurance can be denied, things like that, there are a lot of things around this, that's your digital identity, and that can be used against you, potentially. And that digital footprint is a problem. And again, it will affect things. We know there's been, people have looked at the use of AI in job applications, sifting through big sets of job applications. We know that it does not like disability, in that if it perceives somebody in that job set to be disability, if it's showing the trace of disability. Again, if it's an online thing and it's been able to track how someone's filled in a form and they've had to use assistive tech to do that, is it going to factor that in? We don't know. We don't know what it's tracking. So again, I think it's a thing that we're potentially pushing students to kind of almost disclose without knowing they've disclosed in their digital footprint with some of this. Again, I don't know what the answer to this one is because it is an extension of something that already exists. Another thing I want to mention, and obviously the environmental impact does get mentioned a lot, but it has got a specific resonance for disability justice. Disabled people are disproportionately negatively impacted by climate change. That climate events disable people, but also disabled people tend to get left behind, are often the first to die. Things like the wildfires, massive disproportionate number of people with disabilities die because they can't evacuate or because of air quality, things like that. It's really, really common. But even just on a personal, this summer, the heat waves, I had days I couldn't work properly because my disabilities are exacerbated by heat. And that's in the north of England. So, you know, globally, this is a really big thing. And if I'm being pushed to use something that I know is going to really hurt other people in the world, but particularly hurt other disabled people, that is uncomfortable for me. And I think there is a question about accessibility around that, around climate justice and accessibility as well, around these tools and the way that they're often marketed. I think there can be a certain level of, I think it's usually purple washing, not sure, it's usually around disability. But often if you can say that it's got an accessibility feature, it helps the company promote it. And they look like they're being ethical. They didn't develop it for the accessibility feature. If you've looked at real accessibility tech, it's really expensive because it's so niche. But if you're trying to develop something mainstream and you want to make your company look better, it's great for accessibility. Is it? And what are the wider impacts for accessibility? There are lots of questions around this, but it's something it's a way that AI is marketed a lot. And part of that, and again, not wading too far into disability theory, is that idea of, do we fix the publisher platform or do we fix the disabled person's ability to access a text? Is this idea of a kind of non-disabled norm, which is what AI assumes. And effectively, the AI is construction marketed to disabled people to fix the problem. It's a deficit model. So instead of making more platforms more flexible and accessible in different ways, we can download format in different ways, we can use screen readers with it, we can navigate with or without a mouse, we can do what we want. It's going, oh, well, you can't do this, so use this app. Use this instead of changing the underlying accessibility of the situation. So there are a few examples of this. So one is the captioning app Ava. And this is primarily marketed for work and study, but there is a horrendous video of this poor woman at a family gathering just being ignored by everyone at the table. And she follows the whole thing on her phone with captioning. But that's really sad because that gathering it's an American advert, so presumably ASL. But there's no attempt to include her. They're not looking at her. There's none of the kind of deaf inclusion behaviour that you would want. And that's a family gathering. And the idea that in your social life, nobody is going to make any attempts to include you or accommodate you is awful, really. So I think there's a real question about the way, again, the way some people are using some of these apps, but certainly the way they're marketed, is that the disabled person takes on the responsibility of them not fitting in. The world doesn't have to accommodate them. We don't need to be more inclusive. They've got the app now, it's fine. And it's quite problematic. And there's a big thing around this around neurotypical. Now, there's a lot of autism coaching apps. Now, some of these will be at student level, much more are marketed at children. And that's partly why they're quite so contentious, because there are a lot of issues of consent around this. And again, I think the consent is really the key point, because again, disability is not monolith. Not all autistic people feel the same about it. Some people think this is helpful, help them navigate the world. Others see this as quite offensive. But again, the way it's talked about is offensive, because this is a genuine headline from August this year, from Stanford University. I think that's quite offensive, because autistic people are perfectly capable of feeling empathy. The way they express it or the cues they're responding to and things may be very different. But the idea that a digital tool, a robot, is teaching a human to feel empathy is a very negative way of talking about somebody with autism. I don't think that's a helpful thing to do. Now, the actual tool may or may not be helpful for people, but that's not a helpful way to talk about it. So again, I think the way that these tools are being created and marketed is a bit of a problem. The other thing around this is, did anyone ask? Because there are some people who might find this helpful, but again, that purple washing, we're producing things for you. It's accessible, there we go. Did anyone ask? Because nothing about us without it, really. Because it's a problem we see with a lot of tools that, again, if we're being awkward in a procurement seminar, we'll ask what testing's been done and has it been designed with people? And you'll be told it's designed to be accessible, which doesn't mean anything. Decisions are taken from us all the time. And personally, I don't want to use most AI tools because they're doing things I can do. And I don't want them to, I can do those things. Those are things I am capable of, and I do not want that taken away from me. Everyone, as I say, everyone feels differently about this. We are not a monolith. Disability community is lots of very fractured communities. But what tool is taking away decisions from us? Who's designed this? Did we co-design this? Did we ask for this? Because I think when we work with students, a lot of the students we work want to be able to access things. They don't want an app to do stuff for them. They just want to be able to use the stuff they've got to access things and access it properly. So again, for me, I think there's a fundamental thing. If we made everything more inclusive, we probably wouldn't need a lot of this. That's not good from a marketing point of view, I appreciate, but certainly in terms of a lot of the students we talk to, that feels to me a more helpful approach. So I suppose the key things to take away from this, apart from vague discomfort, AI remediation tools are not particularly reliable. So I'm a huge fan of accessibility checkers, but they only take you so far. Because if you put the word image in your image description, tick, you've got image description. That's of no use to anyone. So they're really helpful and they're good to get you into good habits, but they always need checking. And they can give this illusion of, yeah, I've run it through this, it's accessible. Well, if it's rubbish AI generated alt text that makes no sense, is that going to help people? The fixing materials, it's an afterthought. It's not part of the creative process. I'm going to use AI for that because it's not part of my teaching, really. I wouldn't use AI in the rest of my handout. I can use it for those bits. I think there's questions here about how we're approaching accessibility. And I think maybe some questions about why we're doing that. Pushing people to fix a perceived deficit. Now, again, different people behave differently around this, but if you are not adjusting your teaching, but you are pushing somebody to use an AI app to access it, I'm not sure what message that sends. I think there are questions here about students' experience around that. And the kind of wider thing about why are we so keen to abdicate and outsource this? And particularly to AI. It's not even worth the person doing it. And that's how that comes across to a lot of people. Not everyone, as I say, no monoliths in this. But I think there are questions about what messages we're giving with our use of AI as well. So that is my kind of very quick run through, because I think we wanted to have some questions around this, because I think it's probably quite a question-based thing. And I've seen Lillian typing, so I'm assuming there are some questions.
You mentioned about web of science and not getting reliable searches back from it. Are you seriously worried about that?
It's only if you use so there's a question there about the Web of Science thing. It's not all of Web of Science, it's if you use the research assistant. So if you go in and do a structured search, that's not affected. But it's specifically these research assistant tools. So some of them have names, you can kind of try to make them more friendly. But yeah, it's the research, it's the AI search elements.
I've not looked at it for a while. Is that a relatively new thing?
Very new, yeah.
Right.
That's a very new thing. So most of them are adding in AI research assistants. But again, there's, from a library perspective, there's a lot of questions about what value that adds. Because with most generative AI prompts and things, you have to write quite a structured thing to get it to give you what you want, at which point you've kind of written a structured search. So if you use an advanced search and use the fields there, as opposed to writing a small paragraph but prompt, I'm not, personally, I don't know what time you're saving with that.
What audience do you think they're targeting that to then? Because most people who would use that type of search engine would use the sort of structured search approach, because that's the target audience for that type of software. Again, automation bias, the computer will be better than me. There's a huge amount of stuff. Web of Science is huge. What do I know? Particularly for people starting out on their careers, there's a lot of lack of confidence around this. So sometimes when we've done training sessions for new research students, I've had them asking about stuff, and some of my colleagues are still running these, and they will ask about, what do you think about this? And frankly, generally, I would trust the person working in that area to tell me if something's relevant or not. And I would trust that over the search engine research assistant thing currently.
But I think there's that lack of confidence. The computer will know better than I will. And these are marketed really, really heavily. They're marketed like, this is going to transform your research. This is going to save you so much time. This is going to make your life much easier. And again, we're in a time-poor society. People are very anxious. People are often very pressured. And the cost of education, cost of living crisis, people are feeling very pressured to do very well in their degrees. I can understand the temptation to this kind of thing. So I think a lot of it is playing on lack of confidence around that. And really heavy marketing for more early career things. As you say, I think most established academics wouldn't want to use it. Certainly as a librarian, I don't really see where it's adding value. That would be, I don't see what, if I'm doing a structured search, I know what I've done with it, and I've had to write something that long to get the prompt right. So
I know our subject librarians do a training course for our undergraduates. I don't know what they've done this year. I don't know whether they've included that or not.
I don't think, generally, we haven't looked at the AI research assistants. I don't think we turn them on in a lot of our stuff. Generally, with undergraduates, for the library induction things, I was a librarian previous to being in this role, is around kind of basic Boolean searching, understanding the kind of the scope of different databases and kind of how to filter in them. So it's kind of introducing people to those rather than using anything like that. So again, I think that's a better foundation of understanding search skills.
You say you can turn it off?
Some of them is turning off or on. So I haven't looked at the Web of Science thing with the research AI assistant. I don't know if we have turned that off or on, or I don't know if you can on that one. I know for certain library catalogues and other things, so for example, our library catalogue, we don't have the AI assistant on currently. So I'm not quite sure what the Web of Science situation is, and that is a really recent development. I feel like some people said this is very negative. It's not. There are some amazing uses. So things like Notebook LM allows people to access material in really different ways. There are things there that I think have got some really good potential. Went to an amazing conference that was held at the School of ACT, the Darcy conference in September, and somebody there was looking at captioning, and he was using a closed AI tool, effectively kind of running an algorithm on data to compare the length of episodes of television with their transcript with the captioning. And if there's a sudden massive discrepancy in that with the captioning, it flags it, and then somebody goes back. And I thought that was really interesting because most of the captioning focus has always been on it recognising words, and this was a human would go in and correct it, but it was flagging where there are problems, which if you've got a whole backlog of TV that you're trying to make accessible and put on an online streaming platform, that's really helpful. It's identifying the problem things for people to go and fix. There are all sorts of things where I think there's some really good uses, but as I say, this is about generative AI, and I think at the moment a lot of it feels very unquestioning to me and really heavily marketed. But I think what I feel uncomfortable about is that heavy marketing is so often towards students, and particularly disabled students, with you're not going to get this right, but this is going to fix it for you. And I think anything selling you a silver bullet is probably something to question just generally in life. But it is playing on that insecurity.
Very good point. And Alice has written about this and it's been published by the UN and all that. So yeah, this is really good, thought-provoking stuff.